the Salt March and the Civil Disobedience Movement. Mahatma Gandhi found in salt a powerful symbol that could unite the nation. On 31st January 1930, he sent a letter to Viceroy Irwin stating 11 demands. Some of these were of general interest. Others were specific demands of different classes, from industrialists to peasants. The idea was to make the demands wide-ranging, so that all classes within Indian society could identify with them and everyone could be brought together in a united campaign. The most stirring of all was the demand to abolish the salt tax. Salt was something consumed by the rich and the poor alike, and it was one of the most essential items of food. The tax on salt and the government monopoly over its production, Mahatma Gandhi declared, revealed the most oppressive face of British rule. Mahatma Gandhi's letter was, in a way, an ultimatum. If the demands were not fulfilled by 11th March, the letter stated the Congress would launch a civil disobedience campaign. Irwin was unwilling to negotiate. So Mahatma Gandhi started his famous Salt March accompanied by 78 of his trusted volunteers. The march was over 240 miles from Gandhiji's ashram in Sabarmati to the Gujarati coastal town of Dandi. The volunteers walked for 24 days, about 10 miles a day. Thousands came to hear Mahatma Gandhi wherever he stopped, and he told them what he meant by Swaraj and urged them to peacefully defy the British. On 6th April, he reached Dandi and ceremonially violated the law manufacturing salt by boiling seawater. This marked the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. How was this movement different from the non-cooperation movement?
This marked the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. How was this movement different from the non-cooperation movement? People were now asked not only to refuse cooperation with the British, as they had done in 1921 to 1922, but also to break colonial laws. Thousands in different parts of the country broke the salt law, manufactured salt, and demonstrated in front of government salt factories. As the movement spread, foreign cloth was boycotted and liquor shops were picketed. Peasants refused to pay revenue and chowkidari taxes. Village officials resigned. And in many places, forest people violated forest laws, going into reserved forests to collect wood and graze cattle. Worried by the developments, the colonial government began arresting the Congress leaders one by one. This led to violent clashes in many places. When Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a devout disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, was arrested in April 1930. Angry crowds demonstrated in the streets of Peshawar, facing armored cars and police firing. Many were killed. A month later, when Mahatma Gandhi himself was arrested, industrial workers in Sholapur attacked police posts, municipal buildings, law courts, and railway stations, all structures that symbolized British rule. A frightened government responded with a policy of brutal repression. Peaceful satyagrahis were attacked. Women and children were beaten, and about 1 lakh people were arrested. In such a situation, Mahatma Gandhi once again decided to call off the movement and entered into a pact with Irvin on 5th March 1931. By this Gandhi-Irvin pact, Gandhiji consented to participate in a round-table conference. The Congress had boycotted the first round-table conference in London, and the government agreed to release the political prisoners. In December 1931, Gandhiji went to London for the conference, but the negotiations broke down and he returned disappointed. Back in India, he discovered that the government had begun a new cycle of repression. Ghaffar Khan and Jawaharlal Nehru were both in jail. The Congress had been declared illegal, and a series of measures had been imposed to prevent meetings, demonstrations, and boycotts. With great apprehension, Mahatma Gandhi relaunched the civil disobedience movement. For over a year, the movement continued, but by 1934, it lost its momentum. How participants saw the movement. Let us now look at the different social groups that participated in the civil disobedience movement. Why did they join the movement? What were their ideals? What did Swaraj mean to them? In the countryside, rich peasant communities like the Pattidars of Gujarat and the Jats of Uttar Pradesh were active in the movement. Being producers of commercial crops, they were very hard hit by the trade depression and falling prices. As the cash income disappeared, they found it impossible to pay the government's revenue demand. And the refusal of the government to reduce the revenue demand led to widespread resentment. These rich peasants became enthusiastic supporters of the civil disobedience movement, organizing their communities and at times forcing reluctant members to participate in the boycott program. For them, the fight for Swaraj was a struggle against high revenues. But they were deeply disappointed when the movement was called off in 1931 without the revenue rates being revised. So when the movement was restarted in 1932, many of them refused to participate. The poorer peasantry were not just interested in the lowering of the revenue demand. Many of them were small tenants cultivating land they had rented from landlords. As the depression continued and cash incomes dwindled, the small tenants found it difficult to pay their rent. They wanted the unpaid rent to the landlord to be remitted. They joined a variety of radical movements, often led by socialists and communists. Apprehensive of raising issues that might upset the rich peasants and landlords, the Congress was unwilling to support no-rent campaigns in most places. So the relationship between the poor peasants and the Congress remained uncertain. Interests. What about the business classes? How did they relate to the civil disobedience movement? During the First World War, Indian merchants and industrialists had made huge profits and become powerful. Keen on expanding their business, they now reacted against colonial policies that restricted business activities. They wanted protection against imports of foreign goods and a rupee sterling foreign exchange ratio that would discourage imports. To organize business interests, they formed the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920 and the Federation of the Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industries, FICCI, in 1927. Led by prominent industrialists like Purushottam Das, Thakur Das, and G.D. Birla, the industrialists attacked colonial control over the Indian economy and supported the civil disobedience movement when it was first launched. They gave financial assistance and refused to buy or sell imported goods. Most businessmen came to see Swaraj as a time when colonial restrictions on business would no longer exist and trade and industry would flourish without constraints. But after the failure of the Round Table Conference, business groups were no longer uniformly enthusiastic. They were apprehensive of the spread of militant activities and worried about prolonged disruption of business as well as the growing influence of socialism amongst the younger members of the Congress. The industrial working classes did not participate in the civil disobedience movement in large numbers, except in the Nagpur region. As the industrialists came closer to the Congress, workers stayed aloof. But in spite of that, some workers did participate in the civil disobedience movement, selectively adopting some of the ideas of the Gandhian program, like boycott of foreign goods, as part of their own movements against low wages and poor working conditions. There were strikes by railway workers in 1930 and dock workers in 1932. In 1930, thousands of workers in Chota Nagpur tin mines wore Gandhi caps and participated in protest rallies and boycott campaigns. But the Congress was reluctant to include workers' demands as part of its program of struggle. It felt that this would alienate industrialists and divide the anti-imperial forces. Another important feature of the civil disobedience movement was the large-scale participation of women. During Gandhiji's Salt March, thousands of women came out of their homes to listen to him. They participated in protest marches, manufactured salt, and picketed foreign cloth and liquor shops. Many went to jail. In urban areas, these women were from high-caste families. In rural areas, they came from rich peasant households. Moved by Gandhiji's call, they began to see service to the nation as a sacred duty of women. Yet, this increased public role did not necessarily mean any radical change in the way the position of women was visualized. Gandhiji was convinced that it was the duty of women to look after home and hearth, be good mothers and good wives. And for a long time, the Congress was reluctant to allow women to hold any position of authority within the organization. It was keen only on their symbolic presence, the limits of civil disobedience. Not all social groups were moved by the abstract concept of Swaraj. One such group was the nation's untouchables, who from around the 1930s had begun to call themselves Dalit or oppressed. For long, the Congress had ignored the Dalits for fear of offending the Sanatanis, the conservative high caste Hindus. But Mahatma Gandhi declared that Swaraj would not come for 100 years if untouchability was not eliminated. He called the untouchables Harijan or the God, organized satyagraha to secure them entry into temples and access to public wells, tanks, roads, and schools. He himself cleaned toilets to dignify the work of the bhangi, that is the sweepers, and persuaded upper castes to change their heart and give up the sin of untouchability. But many Dalit leaders were keen on a different political solution to the problems of the community. They began organizing themselves, demanding reserved seats in educational institutions and a separate electorate that would choose Dalit members for legislative councils. Political empowerment, they believed, would resolve the problems of their social disabilities. Dalit participation in the civil disobedience movement was therefore limited, particularly in the Maharashtra and Nagpur region, where their organization was quite strong. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who organized the Dalits into the Depressed Classes Association in 1930, clashed with Mahatma Gandhi at the Second Round Table Conference by demanding separate electorates for Dalits. When the British government conceded Ambedkar's demand, Gandhiji began a fast unto death. He believed that separate electorates for Dalits would slow down the process of their integration into society. Ambedkar ultimately accepted Gandhiji's position, and the result was the Pune Pact of September 1932. It gave the depressed classes, later to be known as the scheduled castes, reserved seats in provincial and central legislative councils, but they were to be voted in by the general electorate. The Dalit movement, however, continued to be apprehensive of the Congress-led national movement. Some of the Muslim political organizations in India were also lukewarm in their response to the civil disobedience movement. After the decline of the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, a large section of Muslims felt alienated from the Congress. From the mid-1920s, the Congress came to be more visibly associated with openly Hindu religious nationalist groups like the Hindu Mahasabha. As relations between Hindus and Muslims worsened, each community organized religious processions with militant fervor, provoking Hindu-Muslim communal clashes and riots in various cities. Every riot deepened the distance between the two communities. The Congress and the Muslim League made efforts to renegotiate an alliance, and in 1927 it appeared that such a unity could be forged. The important differences were over the question of representation in the future assembly that were to be elected. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, one of the leaders of the Muslim League, was willing to give up the demand for separate electorates if Muslims were assured reserved seats in the Central Assembly and representation in proportion to population in the Muslim-dominated provinces of Bengal and Punjab. Negotiations over the question of representation continued, but all hope of resolving the issue at the All Parties Conference in 1928 disappeared when M.R. Jayakar of the Hindu Mahasabha strongly opposed efforts at compromise. When the civil disobedience movement started, there was thus an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust between communities. Alienated from the Congress, large sections of Muslims could not respond to the call for a united struggle. Many Muslim leaders and intellectuals expressed their concern about the status of Muslims as a minority within India. They feared that the culture and identity of minorities would be submerged under the domination of a Hindu majority.
Of collective belonging. Nationalism spreads when people begin to believe that they are all part of the same nation, when they discover some unity that binds them together. But how did the nation become a reality in the minds of people? How did people belonging to different communities, regions, or language groups develop a sense of collective belonging? This sense of collective belonging came partly through the experience of united struggles. But there were also a variety of cultural processes through which nationalism captured people's imagination. History and fiction, folklore and songs, popular prints and symbols, all played a part in the making of nationalism. Bharat Mata. The identity of the nation, as you know, is most often symbolized in a figure or image. This helps create an image with which people can identify the nation.
It was in the 20th century, with the growth of nationalism, that the identity of India came to be visually associated with the image of Bharat Mata. The image was first created by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. In the 1870s, he wrote Vande Mataram as a hymn to the motherland. Later, it was included in his novel Anand Mat and widely sung during the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. Moved by the Swadeshi movement, Rabindranath Tagore painted his famous image of Bharat Mata. In this painting, Bharat Mata is portrayed as an ascetic figure. She is calm, composed, divine, and spiritual. In subsequent years, the image of Bharat Mata acquired many different forms as it circulated in popular prints and was painted by different artists. Devotion to this mother figure came to be seen as evidence of one's nationalism. Origin of Indian folk tradition. Ideas of nationalism also developed through a movement to revive Indian folklore. In late 19th century India, nationalists began recording folk tales sung by bards and they toured villages to gather folk songs and legends. These tales, they believed, gave a true picture of traditional culture that had been corrupted and damaged by outside forces. It was essential to preserve this folk tradition in order to discover one's national identity and restore a sense of pride in one's past. In Bengal, Rabindranath Tagore himself began collecting ballads, nursery rhymes, and myths and led the movement for folk revival. In Madras, Natesha Shastri published a massive 4-volume collection of Tamil folk tales, the folklore of southern India. He believed that folklore was as national literature. It was the most trustworthy manifestation of people's real thoughts and characteristics. Feeling of nationalism. As the national movement developed, nationalist leaders became more and more aware of such icons and symbols in unifying people and inspiring in them a feeling of nationalism. During the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, a tricolour flag, red, green, and yellow, was designed. It had 8 lotuses representing 8 provinces of British India and a crescent moon representing Hindus and Muslims. By 1921, Gandhiji had designed the Swaraj flag. It was again a tricolour, red, green, and white, and had a spinning wheel in the centre representing the Gandhian ideal of self-help. Carrying the flag, holding it aloft during marches became a symbol of defiance. Another means of creating a feeling of nationalism was through reinterpretation of history. By the end of the 19th century, many Indians began feeling that to instill a sense of pride in the nation, Indian history had to be thought about differently. The British saw Indians as backward and primitive, incapable of governing themselves. In response, Indians began looking into the past to discover India's great achievement. They wrote about the glorious developments in ancient times when art and architecture, science and mathematics, religion and culture, law and philosophy, crafts and trade had flourished. This glorious time, in their view, was followed by a history of decline when India was colonized. These nationalist histories urged the readers to take pride in India's great achievements in the past and struggle to change the miserable conditions of life under British rule. These efforts to unify people were not without problems. When the past being glorified was Hindu, when the images celebrated were drawn from Hindu iconography, then people of other communities felt left out. Conclusion. A growing anger against the colonial government was thus bringing together various groups and classes of Indians into a common struggle for freedom in the first half of the 20th century. The Congress, under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, tried to channel people's grievances into organized movements for independence. Through such movements, the nationalists tried to forge a national unity. But as we have seen, diverse groups and classes participated in these movements with varied aspirations and expectations. As their grievances were wide-ranging, freedom from colonial rule also meant different things to different people. The Congress continuously attempted to resolve differences and ensure that the demands of one group did not alienate another. This is precisely why the unity within the movement often broke down. The high points of Congress activity and nationalist unity were followed by phases of disunity and inner conflict between groups. In other words, what was emerging was a nation with many voices wanting freedom from colonial rule. 1918 to 1919. Distressed UP peasants organized by Baba Ramchandra. April 1919. Gandhian Hartal against Rollout Act. Jallianwala Bagh massacre. January 1921. Non-cooperation and Khilafat movement launched. February 1922. Chauri Chaura, Gandhiji withdraws non-cooperation movement. May 1924. Alluri Sitaram Raju arrested, ending a 2-year armed tribal struggle. December 1929. Lahore Congress. Congress adopts the demand for Purn Swaraj. 1930. Ambedkar establishes Depressed Classes Association. March 1930. Gandhiji begins civil disobedience movement by breaking salt law at Dandi. March 1931. Gandhiji ends civil disobedience movement. December 1931. Second Round Table Conference. 1932. Civil disobedience relaunch.